We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm excited to see Marie, albeit virtually. I've known her for a very long time. I also just want to say that today is bittersweet for me. Some of you know that I've been on a 3-year retirement program, and this is the last semester, so I will officially be retired in May. And I talked with Mark about it. This has been 17 years that I've been doing this. I don't know how I was the one that got roped into doing this. I blame Carol Rose immensely for this. It was her idea originally, but somehow or other, I'm the one who ended up directing it until the last few years, and Kirsten came along and became co-director. But still, it's been a good road. So I'm stepping to one side, but Priya Sundarshan, who's on the call today and is on most of these, will become the co-director with Kirsten, and so the program will be in able hands, and I will still be around teaching water law. Mark asked me to do that, and happy to do that. So it will just be a slight transition. Marie Pearthree is one of the very few people over these 17 years who's not a regular UA faculty member. But when I bumped into her a year ago and found out she had this book forthcoming, it just made seemed like a perfect match. I was certainly involved as a member of the Citizens Water Advisory Committee when all of this unraveled. And for those of you who don't know it, I mean, brown water came out of taps in Tucson. It was a betrayal of the public trust of the first order. And the story of how that happened and how Tucson has now become a utility that's widely admired around the United States for being a really first-rate water department is what Marie's going to talk about. So this is her book. I highly recommend it. And without any further doubt, at least no doubt that I will intentionally inflict on you, I'm going to try to make her a participant. Okay. Host disabled. Is that the wrong way of doing this? Host disabled screen sharing. Huh. Can I do it this way? What on earth is wrong?
Do you want me to try sharing my screen?
Here we go. Here we go. Take this. No, that wasn't Mark. Mark, you have an answer?
You should be able to make Marie just a co-host or transfer hosting duties. If you're the host, you go into participants and click on her name, and you should be able to do it right there.
Okay.
Robert, you might have to claim host at the bottom.
Claim host. Okay, thank you. Host to a keychain.
Oh, no.
No.
Wait, we figured this out a while back.
Marie, do you see at the bottom of your participant list something that says claim host? Invite, mute me.
I have invite.
And then invite, mute me, claim host, or no, you just have invite?
I just have invite.
Claiming host, you need a key that's available on your home page in Zoom. So if you go to your home page in Zoom, it has a key for claiming host.
Marie, were you going to share PowerPoints or?
Yes, I have a PowerPoint.
So you could send them to Robert, and he could perhaps.
He could. It's kind of painful because I have some animation. I don't see claim host.
If I can suggest,
I see something that says Kirsten Engel is the host, so she can authorize everybody.
Yes.
if you click on participants.
Okay, yes, I just logged in to see if that would work. Let's see if I can do it. Okay.
You are a host now,
Down
and
at the
so
lower right.
Kirsten, share.
Okay, actually, I just allowed multiple participants. Does that work, or else I can
That's
just?
that's a really good answer. That does the trick.
Did that do it?
Marie, can you share screen now?
Shall I try?
Please.
Yay.
Okay. Share. Let me get my.
Hey.
Yep.
Okay.
We
Let me
see
see
it.
if that
It
works.
sure does.
Definite congressional material.
I want,
That's all, if that's all it takes.
are you
That's the
I'll take
first,
it.
it's the first step, baby steps.
so whoops, hang on a second.
I
Are
would
you
have said
seeing,
that exceeds
are you
the
seeing
bars,
the
but
one big slide?
I'm,
no, we're seeing the power, we're seeing probably the same thing you are. So if you start,
I got it. It helps to put on slideshow. There.
there you go.
there we
Does
go.
that work?
All right.
Okay. Ready for me to launch?
Yes, we are. Thank you
Okay.
all for getting me out of that predicament.
Yeah, well, it's always really tricky. So thanks very much for having me today. I'm really honored and pleased to be able to give this presentation. And it really is truly a fascinating story. So I'll just get into it. I do want to mention that I had a co-author that I worked with for several years, Michael McGuire, who was at one point, who basically led the consulting team for the Tucson Water turnaround and had also a role earlier in this whole story. And then I was hired by Tucson Water to be the city's project manager for the whole turnaround part. So that's just a little bit of context. Whoops, let me go to hit my thing. So here's an outline of the presentation. I'll talk about the conversion from groundwater to Central Arizona project water, discuss organizational issues, which have a huge role in the development of the debacle and the turnaround. You'll get a little bit of the whole water treatment part of the story. Also, we'll talk about the condition of the distribution system that relayed Colorado River water to customers. Go through the actual debacle and what occurred. And for those of you who are here for the whole story, I am going to be presenting information that was not known at the time. And then go into the turnaround and success and the lessons learned, which apply, some of them are strictly for utilities, but a number of them apply to any organization whatsoever. And frankly, we were driven to present Tucson's story and wrote this book about it because the same mistakes that Tucson made kept happening at other utilities around the country, as it did in Flint, Michigan in 2014, which was a terrible story, and recently in 2018 in Newark, New Jersey. So the objectives of the presentation are to present the policy decisions by the Tucson Mayor and City Council that caused many of the problems, explore the lack of technical planning and management areas made by Tucson Water before and during the colored water crisis in 1992 to 94, show how a successful management team turned that failure into a real success, and present the lessons learned, as I already mentioned. Sources of information, we reviewed thousands of documents. This is a steel shipping container out in the desert behind the Hayden-Udall water treatment plant in Avra Valley that contained 450 boxes that we had to go through. We also went through other people's files who were good enough to open them up to us. We discovered that no one in Tucson ever throws anything away, which is a blessing, is also a curse. We conducted over 50 interviews with folks who were either part of or witnessed the story from the inside. We also consulted secondary sources like newspapers and interviewed corrosion experts as well. So the Central Arizona project timeline is really important, and it's critical to understand, which I'm sure you do, that Tucson was a groundwater utility prior to the introduction of CAP water. And Tucson Water had their whole utility grew from the 1900s, partly by their own construction of groundwater facilities, pipes, wells, reservoirs, but also by acquiring a large number, it's over 130 of private utilities as the city annexed over time. So you had 200 points of introduction of groundwater into the system, water went in various directions from those wells, and then also, customers were fed from reservoirs. So that's an important background piece to know. But clearly, subsidence was starting to rear its ugly head. Groundwater was being mined. It could only support, by the time you get to the 1980s anyway, when the story really starts, the population that existed in Tucson in the 1940s. So there was starting to be issues with limitations on groundwater, and there was a huge amount of pressure to bring in surface water from the Colorado River as much as possible and as soon as possible. So in 1968, Congress approved the Central Arizona Project. The groundbreaking was at the river, basically where the Mark Wilmer plant is now. By 1985, the water arrived in Phoenix. In 1991, it was initially delivered to Tucson, and by November 1992, it was actually served to Tucson water customers. But there were really large differences between the quality of CAP water and groundwater. pH, the relative acidity of the water, was quite different from groundwater, 8.3 versus 7.6, although operators drove that pH down to the level of 7.6 when they operated the plant. And then the total dissolved solids, of course, was also hugely different. The median raw water CAP had a level of 691 versus groundwater of 276. And the pH and TDS, total dissolved solids, were burned into the public's brain as issues before and during and after the debacle occurred. So I'm kind of focused on those two parameters, even though there are some other parameters that are also different. Switching, because a number of these things will sort of occur in parallel, switching to what was going on at Tucson Water, I need to talk briefly about the organizational structure. So pre-1988, the director was Frank Brooks. He was widely admired in the community. He did some really good things, like, acquired through willing buyer, willing seller negotiations, 22,000 acres of land in Aber Valley for the water rights. And that turns out to be an enormous contribution to resolving the whole story and making CAP water available to the community. But he allowed a really siloed organizational structure to exist, where the division managers created their own fiefdoms and communication was truly terrible. So for example, water distribution, which is the pipes, the hydrants, the meters, the valves, and water production, which is wells and reservoirs, pumping plants, water, those kinds of things. Those two managers just despised each other. They couldn't even loan each other equipment without it being a huge fracas, really. And then over on the other side, and you had one assistant director. Over on the other side, it's worth noting where engineering, planning, and water quality are, because it plays into what happened. But the other thing about Tucson Water at this point in time is internal communication was really terrible. There was, at the employee level, there was a rule that was known as the Bill Wright rule, one of the division managers. And that rule was, you may not speak to people outside your area, at your level, or above, without the permission of your supervisor. So clearly, you're just creating these incredible silos. And I also want to mention that the relationship between engineering, which handles the capital improvements program, and the operations group that had to deal with those facilities, maintenance of those facilities, was also really tense. So moving forward to the period of the debacle, a little bit longer than that, actually, from 1990 to 94, Frank Brooks retired, Director Mike Tubbs came in, and then he changed the organizational structure. But a few words about Mike Tubbs. In interviews that we conducted, he was described as aloof, cold, quiet, spent a lot of time in his office. And even after 5 years of him being director, there were employees at Tucson Water who had never seen him. And it's not that big an organization. And then he instituted 2 assistant directors, and put a brand new division, water treatment, under the assistant director whose specialty was administration, finance, customer service. And then under the other assistant director went engineering, planning, and water quality. The important thing to note here is that water treatment is under one director, water quality is under the other, and those two assistant directors also did not like each other and didn't even like to talk to each other. And this is all documented by a study that came out later. But the bottom line here is that you had water treatment, which was responsible for the water being delivered from the brand new Hayden-Udall water treatment plant. And then water quality was responsible for the water quality in the distribution system that was actually being delivered to customers. So there was a real conflict and authority there that ultimately ended up having to be resolved by water treatment, essentially saying we're in charge. And there was another point here. Right, so yes, so that was really the main issue there that played out, plus the lack of communication between those two assistant directors. So the managing the conversion, there wasn't one manager in Tucson Water that had ever converted a groundwater utility to a mixed surface water groundwater system. So what did they do? They did what they should have done. They hired the best consultants they could find. And at that time, nationally renowned, two top-level joint ventures were contracted. One was Montgomery Johnson Britton from 81 to 84, whose job was to work with the community to set the finished water quality that would be served. And then Corrosion Black and Veatch from 85 to 94 to design and build the treatment plant. But Tucson had really, truly disastrous relationships with consultants. In general, there were some folks inside Tucson Water that viewed consultants as the enemy. And ultimately, Montgomery Johnson Britton was fired and Corrosion Black and Veatch was sued after completion and construction and completion of the water treatment plant. And there's one person who was really central to all of that happening, and it was Dave Johnson. He was the project manager for the design of the water treatment plant. And he had a truly negative view of consultants. He actually called Corrosion Black and Veatch avaricious in writing, in memos. And he personally rejected recommendations that they made for studying impacts of CAP water on the distribution. There were on many occasions in the 80s, Corrosion Black and Veatch begged Tucson Water to authorize them to study the impact of the new water on the distribution system. And he categorically rejected it. And in one meeting, he actually mentioned to staff that they were just after more money. So back to the mayor and council for a second, the second, well, actually it's not the second, this is one of the first truly disastrous policy decisions was on May 29th, 1984, the Tucson City Council adopted a trihalomethane goal of 20 micrograms per liter. And trihalomethanes are carcinogenic compounds created when chlorine interacts with organic matter. And Central Arizona Project water, being mostly Colorado River water, has a higher level of organic matter in it than groundwater does. And the Montgomery Johnson Britton and Tucson Water were aware that the EPA was going to be lowering the standard from the existing limit, which was 100 micrograms per liter. There's some thought that they were actually thinking that it might go as low as 20. But what really happened was by virtue of the TCE contamination crisis on the south side of town in the early 1980s, the Tucson Water and the Mayor and Council did not want CAP water to be viewed as any less healthy than regular groundwater. And so that decision drove the design of the treatment plant, and the consequences of that decision, which you'll see were really severe. So Montgomery Johnson Britton had strongly recommended a conventional treatment plant with sedimentation basins ahead of the whole treatment process. And that's a typical design to treat Colorado River. It was in use extensively in California. But with advice from a professor at the U of A by the name of Ray Circa, he was really invested in ozone and direct filtration as a concept for treating surface water. And he and Dave Johnson and other senior managers in that area at Tucson Water really latched onto the idea of a cutting edge ozone direct filtration chloramine treatment plant. It was really, I mean, they really wanted the Ferrari as opposed to the Ford. And they chose the direct filtration plant. I'll show you a quick schematic of that in a second. But the issue there, of course, is that they had never operated a treatment plant to start with. And choosing a real cutting edge plant also had significant consequences. And ultimately, that plant became sort of the shiny object that they were really focused on, that in my opinion, distracted them from considering other equally important issues as, what's going to happen when CAP water hits the distribution system, for example. So they were really focused on this treatment plant. And I'm not going to go through the whole diagram, but what I really want you to see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is this area right here. By the way, just really quickly, these are the ozonators. This is sort of part of the direct filtration process. And at the end of that process, there's an option right here that Corolla Black & Veatch built into the treatment plant. One is to use NaOH or caustic soda for pH control, which is used throughout California for corrosion control. And it was also plumbed for zinc orthophosphate, which is a corrosion inhibitor. So what did they do? They chose zinc orthophosphate. Actually, the superintendent for operations at the plant chose the zinc orthophosphate, and the water treatment administrator went along with that. The interesting thing about that choice is that documents show that it was chosen for two really different reasons and contradictory reasons. One was the idea was zinc orthophosphate would, when you put it into the distribution system, would strip the corrosion products in the distribution system that had been in equilibrium with groundwater for decades. And then you could flush that stuff out like you do when you normally operate a groundwater system and flush out sand, for instance. And the other reason it was chosen is it would lay down a blanket and essentially stabilize the corrosion deposits. Well, you can't have it both ways. So clearly there was a left hand not talking to a right hand in here somewhere. So what happened in November 1992, when Tucson Water essentially flipped the switch and fed the water into half the service area virtually overnight. This is just one picture of the kind of water that people got out of their taps. I live in the area of town that became affectionately known as Ground Zero. And at my house, I had yellow water, I had rusty water. It was, you couldn't do anything when this crappy brown water comes out of your faucets. And plus pipes broke, et cetera. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But this is basically the kind of thing that people were looking at. And essentially, it wasn't really usable for the normal ways that you use water. So by virtue of how the distribution system is set up with pressure zones and pipes and reservoirs, this is the area that Tucson Water served CAP water to through the brand new treatment plant. And that black box, the colored water area, is Ground Zero, where the issues with pipes breaking and colored water were the worst. It's about a square mile. But issues were also occurring elsewhere in the areas served. So what's truly fascinating is that at the time, there was 200 miles of galvanized steel pipe in the distribution system. This is old pipe. It's 1 inch to 2 inch mains in the streets, and as well as home plumbing. And this is a picture of a pipe out of my house that shows the corrosion deposits that were in existence in my home plumbing, for instance. So you not only had pipes breaking in the streets, you also had pipes breaking in people's homes. The second really poor decision that the mayor and city council made over time was to keep stripping funding for main replacement out of Tucson Water's budget. Because not only did they want the water to be perceived as healthy as groundwater, they also didn't want it to be more expensive than groundwater, because the debacle about cost of service rates, what was known as lift rates in the 1976-77 era, was still resonating because people's water bills went up a lot. 4 council members were recalled. It was an enormous issue. And it put water forefront in the public's mind as being a pocketbook issue. And we spoke to some of the council members after all of this as part of the book. And one in particular, Molly McCassin, admitted that stripping main replacement funding was a big mistake that the mayor and council made. So you had this really incredibly crappy pipe in the distribution system, and senior management didn't really seem to be aware that it was there. The field forces certainly were, because they had to keep patching it and replacing it all the time. But it didn't appear that senior management at Tucson Water was aware that this was out there. So what happens under stable conditions of groundwater? There are 2 layers of corrosion deposits in the pipes that were, again, stable. One was in pink was the aerobic layer, and then of course the gray is the anaerobic layer. And if you put in CAP water with flow from a different direction, different water quality, the water basically ate through the aerobic layer into the anaerobic layer. So in addition to all of this iron appearing in the customer's taps, you also had terrible smells that occurred with the water too. Descriptions were rotten eggs, sulfurous, disgusting. I mean, customers were really quite creative in describing what was coming out of their taps. So debacle, it's headed squarely for a disaster. So November 1992, the CAP water was turned on. Complaints began almost immediately, related primarily to pressure, because there were valves that were open that should have been closed, and valves that were closed that should have been open. And I'll show you a picture of the graph of the complaints in just a second. But as customer outrage started to grow, and Tucson Water really thought that they might have a problem for a few weeks, but then it would go away, and it did not go away. It got worse and worse. Tucson Water started stonewalling. They blamed plumbers for getting people excited. They accused Southwest Gas of causing the problems by work that they were doing in the general area. And ultimately, the city manager muzzled Tucson Water. And what happened is water activists stepped into that vacuum, and the mayor and council took over. So the political solutions came in, and the political solution by the mayor and council initially was to cut the service area in half, return half to groundwater, and just let CAP water keep being delivered to the other half. The problem with that, of course, is that the complaints continued, and it got worse and worse. And ultimately, the mayor and council voted to shut off the system. And this is what the complaints in the timeline look like. They shut it off in September of '94, and essentially said, don't bring CAP water back into Tucson unless you can deliver it without any problems. This is the point in time when the canal went down for maintenance, for the normal 3-week maintenance that CAP does. And that's when they said, we're turning this off. There were about 12,000 complaints centered around color and smell and people's appliances blowing up. I mean, my hot water heater failed, for instance. I had a pipe break in the night, flooded half the house. But there were lots of complaints. Some were bogus, but most of them were legitimate. And you'll notice in this graph that the highest peaks of complaints occurred over the summers. So water temperature clearly played a role in this. And it looks like the operators of the plant might have missed the connection between water temperature complaints and what they were doing to try and stabilize the situation. It's very interesting. So since that date, the treatment plant's been rusting in the sun. Buildings are being used for other purposes, but the entire treatment plant process is crumbling. So I want to talk really briefly about pH variations in the plant. You'll notice that over the period of time when the plant was operated, the operators were struggling to try and get hold of the situation. They knew that pH was is a corrosion control tool, but they were trying to fix this on the fly under incredible pressure. So it varied between 7 and 8.5, depending upon consultant recommendations. It was completely unsuccessful because they weren't given the amount of time that it would take to stabilize the deposits in the distribution system by using caustic soda. So that was a failure, a widely recognized failure. The other thing about the corrosion inhibitor is that you will, and the blue is what the dose was coming out of the plant, and the red is just the residual that showed up once the water was served from the plant. What's really interesting here is you'll notice that zinc orthophosphate was served from day one. It's almost incomprehensible that that wasn't well known. And there are senior managers at Tucson Water, the public information officer at the time, other managers who did not know that zinc orthophosphate was delivered from the first day of operation of the plant. And some of you may remember that there was a whole, gosh, how do I say this? As the debacle occurred and as the customer complaints got worse and worse and worse, what Tucson Water and the city manager jumped on was, we're going to now start serving zinc orthophosphate to get a handle on this. And that was in like months, in August of '93, months after the plant had been turned on and the problem was happening. So the reason here why you've got such a wide variety of dosing is, again, you had consultants making recommendations who didn't know anything about the distribution system. And that was also ineffective. But what blows my mind, frankly, is the lack of knowledge. Mike Tubbs knew it, of course, and he said we've been serving this since the beginning in several newspaper reports. But what went out to the public in terms of memos from Tucson Water to the city manager to mayor and council is, months after the plant started, we're going to start using zinc orthophosphate. And what really truly blows my mind is the public information officer then launched a campaign likening zinc orthophosphate to Pepto-Bismol, soothes, coats, and protects. And when I told him, I said, this is a few years ago, I said, did you know that they've been dosing that from the first day? He about fell off his chair. So the lack of internal communication was truly stupendous. And those kinds of failures in communication and accuracy and information out to the public just destroyed, ultimately, Tucson Water's credibility. So the bottom line is Tucson Water lacked experience in delivering surface water, had poor internal management. Treatment plant operators were trying to fix the problem on the fly under extreme pressure. Customers were so angry that they passed an initiative, the Water Consumer Protection Act, also known as Prop 200, that was put forth by a group called the Pure Water Coalition in 1995. And essentially, it's important to know that the act restricted the quality of CAP water that could be served, restricted the uses of CAP water, and promoted recharge in the area of the central well field. So, turning point. For several years, Tucson Water really went sideways because there was a true lack of vision about how to deal with this. They went off and, at Mayor Miller's request, looked at membrane filtration. There's a whole bunch of things that were proposed and various heads rolled in the interim. But essentially the only way to start getting a handle on the problem was to apologize. So the assistant city manager at the time, John Nachbar, issued an apology on the part of the city to all customers and said, we're sorry. A few years ago, we let you down. We want to take responsibility for serving discolored water and apologize to each and every one of you. The city also took responsibility for mismanaging the pH control. And in this apology, John Nachbar also apologized to all the Tucson Water employees who had nothing to do with any of this. The folks that, customer service folks, field maintenance folks, apologized to them as well. And that was huge because it's pretty well known that if you don't take on the accountability for what's been caused, then you just can't move forward. So here's how the turnaround really happened. The first thing that happened besides the apology were bench scale corrosion studies. This is really the low tech but highly effective setup here where those were done. And the result to try and figure out what had happened was that Tucson Water, because they hadn't done corrosion studies, chose water quality parameters that would produce and did produce the greatest amount of visible iron at customers' taps. They chose the worst combination that they could have in terms of treatment of the water from the plant. Then pilot scale studies were done to determine a non-corrosive future water quality. And the result of that was that a blend of recharged CAP water, recharge being put it in the ground and recover it with groundwater, produced no visible iron in the water that would be served ultimately. Also, the community was brought in a big way to help determine the water quality that would be acceptable. So there was this flavor profile analysis. It's a sort of a technical process with expert panels, customers, and the media. Arthur D. Little facilitated that. And that process determined the optimal blend for much larger demonstration scale public studies, which was the Ambassador Neighborhoods program. So 4 neighborhoods volunteered to try the new water for 90 days each. And it was a blend of water, CAP water that was recharged. Whoops, I need to go back, sorry about that. That was blended out in Avra Valley from water from a groundwater well, transported into Tucson in this big truck, and then served to the neighborhood for 90 days in a whole separate storage, and pumping system to get it into a whole bunch of houses. It was hugely successful. The media, of course, was all over this, but those residents became real ambassadors for the new water supply. Also, working with the community, more than 1 million sports bottles of the new water, the new blend, were handed out around town. And there were 10,500 5-gallon coolers, at 81 sites, public sites like libraries and such over town as well, because it became clear that everybody had to try the new water. And that was incredibly successful. There was a new water team that came into town as part of this whole process. I joined Tucson Water in '97. David Modier, the new director who's in the back with the striped shirt and the tie, became the new director. And he had a completely different philosophy. He came from the private sector, completely different philosophy about how to sort of manage an organization. He was open, he was approachable, he didn't care what status you had within the organization. If you could bring information to the table that would help deal with this turnaround, you were welcome. He really became the face of Tucson Water. People found him to be very, very believable. And that was huge for the turnaround being successful. Also, hundreds of Tucson Water volunteers were out every weekend at events. There was a speakers bureau, an information van, public service announcements, all over the media as well, newsletters. And one of the really awesome things that David did was to build partnerships in the community, such as with the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, University of Arizona, other businesses. And we also instituted a real-time water quality information for the public where you could go online or go through your phone to get the water quality in your neighborhood at that point in time. And this was so successful that in 1999, an even more restrictive proposition was put on the ballot to restrict use of CAP water, and that was handily defeated by the voters. The other thing that's really important to know is that beginning in 1996, the Central Abra Valley Storage and Recovery Project was begun, and it's 300 acres of recharge basins, 25 recovery wells. That is the current delivery system, treatment and delivery system for CAP water into the city to this day. And it's actually much bigger than this at this point in time. So on May 3rd, 2001 at 10 a.m., the Clearwater Facility was put into operation. And that's Mayor Walkup giving signal by radio to gentlemen, start the pumps. And I have to say that Mayor Walkup's leadership was critical in this. He was backing Tucson Water's efforts all the way. And we had the freedom and the ability to get done what needed to be done. And we'll always be grateful for that. So what's the outcome? Water quality goals have been met. The mayor and council goals that were set early on have been met and continue to be met by this treatment process. Tucson's primary drinking water supply is now Colorado River water. As of a year or so ago, there was more than 4 years of water that's been banked as well by Tucson Water for the future. And the drinking water supply right now from Colorado River is about 85%. I already mentioned that they banked excess water for the future. Groundwater pumping has been curtailed. Over 80 wells have been shut down, but that's really what they've done is really put them on standby mode, to reduce the risk of land subsidence, particularly in the central part of Tucson. And Tucson has become one of the most drought-resistant cities in the Southwest because now the surface water component and the groundwater component can be managed together conjunctively to meet current and future water resource needs. So ultimately, this is a real success story. And it's hard to underemphasize that. Tucson now is in a very good position. Even with sort of drought and climate change issues, it's still one of the most drought resistant cities in the Southwest. So if you think Tucson is unique, however, think again. And this is why we wrote this book, because a number of utilities, and this is just a small sample, have all experienced corrosion issues, customer outrage, and in some cases, really serious public health disasters. The most well-known being the one in Flint, Michigan, with lead contamination in children's bloodstreams. And then again, I also mentioned Newark, New Jersey had the same issues. Washington, DC in 2001 had a terrible lead contamination problem. And it just keeps happening. So I'm going to get into some of the lessons learned now. The biggest mistake a water utility manager can make when you're faced with this kind of water coming out of the tap, for the love of God, don't say that the water meets all federal and state drinking water standards. Excuse me. I was at the August 1993 public hearing at the Peter Howell Elementary School, because it was just around the corner from my house, when this whole issue just blew up. And there were 300 to 400 people at that public meeting. The cameras were everywhere from the media. And that's when the mayor and council became really aware that they had a very big problem on their hands. And in front of 300 to 400 really angry people, some who were, one guy in particular, who was holding up a jar of this colored water and saying, "Would you make baby formula with this?" Mike Tubb obviously had to say no, but he also said during that public hearing meeting that the water meets all federal and state drinking water standards. And he was just excoriated for that in the press, particularly when they reported on the meeting afterwards. So why should no utility manager ever say that? Because your customers think you're lying. This is what they see. It looks bad. It smells bad. It tastes bad. You can't use it for anything. And they don't understand what drinking water standards means to start with. They just think you're just blowing them off. So, and we know, we've talked to a lot of utility managers. Hundreds have said this. It's crazy. So into the lessons learned, some of these just apply to utilities, but again, a number of them are really just good advice for all organizations. So I'll go through them pretty quickly. Consultants, and they're not in any particular order really. So consultants are your partners. They're not the enemy. You've hired them to give you advice. Pay attention to it. The leading edge can really be the bleeding edge, which you've seen. And in this case, Tucson Water just created this issue and endured an awful lot of self-inflicted pain. That's what bleeding edge really means. It's just, sometimes it's just not worth it to go there. It's clear that stringent water quality goals can have severe unintended consequences, such as the adoption of that trihalomethane level, which, drove the design of the plant to disastrous consequences. Always do the technical and public information work upfront before changing water supplies or treatment processes. And this is a big one. Listen closely to your customers and your critics. It turns out that the critics, Dr. Brett Clough, the Pure Water Coalition, Bob Beaudry, who was financing a lot of the propositions against Tucson Water, and were seriously promoting recharge and in an early stage from the 80s forward, the critics turned out to be right. Tucson Water is implementing recharge and recovery with groundwater, not exactly in the way that those folks wanted to see done, but they're doing it. And that turned out to be by far the better treatment process. Also, sampling customer opinion is fraught with problems. The 51% mandate that Tucson Water got for the finished water quality that was to be served for them also means that 49% of your customers may hate what you do. So it's not a mandate. Develop a comprehensive customer complaint database, keep it updated, break down management silos however you can, because they can just kill you really. Make sure you know what your employees do and what their problems are, and they need to see you. This is obviously a utility one. The next one, which was show up at every major pipeline break or service interruption, not just for the photo op. In the middle of the turnaround, the 96-inch main that delivers water from Aber Valley into the city blew up. The pipe failed. The Clearwater reservoir emptied out in about 38 minutes, all 60 million gallons of it. And we knew that we had to get that pipeline repaired and back up online. This is in February, back up online by May in order to meet summer peak demand. And we did it with the help of the San Diego Water Authority. But again, for utility folks, this is really important. 11 is huge. Do not lie to your customer or policymakers. Lies will break you. Transparency really matters. And we saw that with misstatements coming out of Tucson Water. We saw that with misstatements regarding zinc orthophosphate. We saw it partly with Tucson Water reversing itself on whether they could bifurcate the system. Yes, no, finally they said, yes, we can do it. That's when trust and credibility just go down the tank, essentially. And that's what happened to Tucson Water. Take care of crumbling infrastructure or it will come back to haunt you. And in the case of those galvanized street mains, it sure did. Demand funding, it didn't happen. This is possibly one way to do it, not recommended, but you just have to be really, dedicated to getting funding that's needed. Now, these last ones are pretty self-explanatory. We know all of them, but it's interesting what happens to really good people when they're under the kind of pressure that Tucson Water was under at the time. So they're worth repeating here. Communicate with your staff, customers, and policymakers until they get tired of it. And after Bob Walkup was elected mayor in 1999, and the water situation became under control, he pivoted towards transportation. So clearly water dropped off the front page. People were clearly probably tired of it, and the focus shifted to transportation. Always hire people who are smarter than you are. Always give the credit to someone else. And in the face of even adverse circumstances, be honorable, courageous, and do what's right. And frankly, when you get hold of the situation and you turn it around, it's really important to celebrate success with everyone who's involved. So this was a pretty high level introduction or survey of what happened. There's a lot more to the story. So I suggest reading our book, Tucson Water Turnaround, Crisis to Success. It was published by the American Waterworks Association in 2020, and it's available from the authors and Amazon. And at this point, I'd like to say thank you, and I hope I've left enough time for questions.
That was marvelous, Marie. You sure did a whale of a job. Yes, there is time for questions. I'm not, let's see, something's happening on my screen.
Sorry, I think that was my mistake. What
No
did
worries. I guess
what
you could
did
just,
I do?
I don't think you want to cancel the meeting.
Oh, stop. I stopped share, right?
Yeah.
There we go.
All right, good, good. Okay, well, that was fabulous. You know, I knew it would be.
Thank you.
Such a, an incredible reputation for what you did here. And then you and Dave went up to CAP and turned that around as well. Well, maybe that's your next book. But, there are very few people in the water world who come as highly skilled and as highly qualified as you. So it's been really a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a few minutes. I know some people have to break away for other events, but questions for Marie. Just jump in. Brett.
So I'm curious, given all the recent concerns about the declining water in the Colorado River and thus in CAP, if there are other cities in the Colorado River Basin who have yet to come up with the same potential dilemma, namely mixing groundwater with Colorado river water from CAP. Is that something that's going to be an issue coming up soon for other cities that may need to look to Tucson for guidance in terms of how to do that? Or is that a problem that is in the past or won't be coming up again?
Wow, I'm gonna have to think about that for a second. Because you're talking about Arizona cities, right?
Well, sure,
So-
or maybe even Vegas. I don't know. I'm just curious if this is, if Tucson was sort of the canary in the coal mine, and other cities that have been pumping groundwater and not using CAP water, or have been using CAP water and not using groundwater, are now going to have to figure out how to blend the two of them or deal with both of them at the same time, and may not have any experience to go on, and maybe looking to Tucson. But I don't know if other people have had to deal with that or not.
So I'll give you kind of a broad answer to that. Tucson Water was the canary in the coal mine. It is the Central Abra Valley Storage and Recovery Project that's been expanded to Southern Abra Valley as well, is the only put and take recharge and recovery project in the state. So what that means is that the water goes into the ground and there are recovery wells immediately there to recover it in a blend with groundwater. So other cities in Arizona that have CAP allocations, such as Phoenix, have executed an agreement with Tucson Water for, in times of shortage, in good times, they send part of their CAP water to Tucson to recharge. And in exchange for that, in times of shortage, they keep that, they basically get their water back upstream in the Phoenix area. So it works out really well. That's relatively new. Tucson Water also does that for Oro Valley, for instance, takes Oro Valley's water off the canal, puts it in the ground, can serve it up to Oro Valley. So the potential is there for other cities to do this as well, this kind of conjunctive management. I don't know about other places, but it's certainly being executed in Arizona by some of the cities that have CEP allocations. That's really the best answer I can give you.
Thanks.
I think one of the takeaways that I think is important to what Marie just said is it's really about corrosion. That was the story of Flint. And the story of Flint is the story of potentially hundreds of other communities, particularly in the Midwest, but not just in the Midwest, that have pipes that are so old and are corroding and leaching things into the water supply. So I think, I would say that one of the things that's most useful nationwide, or maybe even globally, about Marie's presentation is it's corrosion. It's corrosion, it's corrosion, it's corrosion, and you need to take steps to address that.
I'd like to ask about how it was. Was it just good luck that we got a good manager, or did the city and people searching do a good job in finding the new person?
Oh, they searched and they did a good job. As a matter of fact, because John Nachbar, the assistant city manager at that point in time, who was also overseeing Tucson Water, knew that that Tucson Water only had one shot at turning things around. They had to get it right the first time. And so David Modier applied for the job when it came open, when the search was instituted. And John Nachbar actually flew out to Pennsylvania, which is where he was at the time, and interviewed him and to kind of get a really good feel. And what David said to him was that the two things of greatest importance in this whole situation was to focus on water quality and customer service. And John knew that that's what he was looking for. So it was a really concerted effort, and a lot of, effort was made to bring in the right person, even though he was from the private sector. And what Nachbar also did was put together a really good team of people to interview the prospective candidates, because there was more than just David Modier, of course. And Jerry Gilbert, who was the lead on that at the time, he's out of California, and basically said David was just head and shoulders above everyone else. So that's how that worked out.
Marie, unfortunately, I have to jump off for another seminar, but I just wanted to put in, did you see that Biden infrastructure plan has billions of dollars for replacing lead pipes? And I was just wondering, would that go pretty far in terms of addressing these issues and cities?
Actually, yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not familiar with what other things are in the bill, but I can tell you that Tucson Water has gone a long way towards replacing any lead pipes that are in the system. They've replaced the galvanized pipe that was a problem, and they've been replacing mostly lead connections in the system these days. Most of any lead pipes that existed in the distribution system back in the day were primarily downtown and like in the Sam Hughes area, for instance. Those are being replaced. There's a very systematic, highly successful program to get rid of all those already in place. And I think they've gone a long way towards doing that. But I'm sure that Tucson Water is looking at that bill as it develops to see what they can get out of it. Thank you. Sure, welcome.
Do you know if they're doing any replacement midtown because of lead pipes? I'm just wondering, because our pipes were recently redone in the Broadway Rosemont area.
I really don't know if that, I don't know because I'm not involved in that at all, but I can tell you who to talk to.
Okay.
His name is Fred Coy, C-O-Y, and he's in charge of that program, and he would be happy to talk to you about it.
Okay.
Marie,
Yes.
thank you for telling this story, a very important one. I'm Michael Brush. I'm a historian on campus.
Okay.
The way you tell the early part of the story, I couldn't help but think, and I'm not being facetious here, but the way you tell the early part of the story, Tucson in the 80s almost looked like a precursor to the Trump White House. And again, I'm not being facetious.
Oh.
I'm about personality, getting in the way of effective organizational effectiveness in a barrier to public policy. You have public and private expressions of disdain coming out of Tucson water, each other, competing interests and fiefdoms. And I mean, is this sort of an early example of how inept government can be when it's led by more of personality or competing visions of what should be appropriate for public policy? Or, I mean, what's your larger sort of conceptual takeaway from this?
I am so glad you asked that question, because the story centers on a technical debacle, but the real story that this is really about management, organizational structure, culture, how people make decisions, good or bad, and the personalities, how much personality plays into that. And so it's like any big disaster. It really turns on those things and a series of poor decisions that really create what happens. And your analogy to the Trump administration is a really good one, frankly, because you had people that were being advised by consultants, but ultimately didn't really know what they were doing, rejected those recommendations in some cases, forged ahead with their own vision, even though that wasn't their expertise, got in each other's way. And ultimately, this was self-inflicted. So yes, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, thanks again for sharing your research and the way you tell the story. Very compelling and engaging. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
It looks to me like it's also part of, you have the wrong person in the wrong place, but then it's a totally top-down organization. And so there's no way for the people down below to get a change in unless they go around the person above them.
Right.
By going to the city, but then that creates its own problems if that guy is very jealous of his power. And so it's very hard to get out of that situation. And your lesson seems to be a public crisis, and a action by the voters is what was needed to dislodge that dysfunctional leader.
And I think there's real merit to that perception, that sort of categorization of what was going on, that once the crisis occurred and all hell broke loose, and it was just a terrible time, and heads rolled and all that, there was an opportunity to turn things around. And knowing that, and being told you have one shot at this, everyone at Tucson Water was rowing the boat in the same direction, because they knew that if they failed, it was just all over.
How did they know they had one shot?
We were told we had one shot, literally.
The consultants?
No, this was from John Nogbar, the assistant city manager. But you also knew it. You had to regain trust and credibility. You had to do the research that was correct. You really only had, at least at that point in time, the sentiment, which was felt very strongly by everyone, is we can't blow this. We have to do it right. We have to make it right. We have to do it right, because if we blow it, we screwed up potentially an entirely renewable water supply for the whole community. It was so important. And everybody felt that strongly. Again, the naysayers were gone, basically. I mean, the folks that were part of the problem were either retired or left, or were, let go or whatever. And so you had a different philosophy, a different culture that was created, and everybody was working together. The meetings in Tucson Water, we had meetings every Tuesday morning that would be going through a checklist of what got accomplished, what needs to happen, what are we forgetting, who's going to do it. And I knew, because I actually was in charge of that the day that Tuesdays became a normal day meant that we had succeeded. So yeah, it was so important.
Well, I think we need to wrap this up now. But congratulations, Marie, not just for the book, but for being such an instrumental part of the turnaround. It's an amazing success story. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.
All right.
Okay, everyone, be safe, be well.
Thank you, Robert, for your leadership on this.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun. Bye-bye.